Does 270Hz make any sense? Today we're going to be looking at the AOC AGON AG275QZ, a 1440p 270Hz IPS monitor that has HDR400 certification and AMD FreeSync technology. In the UK it can be found for roughly £620. So how does it compare to its rivals? Let's find out. So let's jump straight in and talk about that refresh rate and also its display inputs. Now here there's two HDMI 2.0 inputs and two DisplayPort 1.4 inputs. The former is actually going to be limiting you to 1440p at 144Hz. It's a shame that AOC have not included HDMI 2.1 in order for you to benefit from the full bandwidth capabilities. As a result, if you do have a laptop, you'll be limited. Of course, if you have DisplayPort, then it's going to be a non-issue. In my case, I've got an RTX 3080 and when connected over to DisplayPort, I had no problems outputting 1440p at 270Hz or indeed 240Hz. Now, why might you want to run 240Hz on this monitor? Well, at 270Hz, I did notice some chroma subsampling. Indeed, it's running 422, and that is actually quite disappointing. So even though the manufacturer is listing this as a 270Hz monitor, and of course for gamers out there, chroma subsampling might not be of a major issue, but for those people who are going to be browsing the web, or for example doing any sort of picture editing, you will be limited by its limited RGB capabilities. As a result, you might actually want to downscale to 240Hz in order to get the full bandwidth capabilities and thus not suffer from any sort of chroma subsampling. But wait, if you're a hardcore competitive gamer, you might actually still want to run 270Hz. Why is that? Well, due to its response time. So let's dig straight into it. Now it's worth considering that 3D Monitors OSD, you've got a few different overdrive modes that you can select. And in this respect, in its overdrive mode off and at 240Hz via the OSRTT tool, I recorded an average initial time of 5.98 milliseconds, which you'll be able to see at the bottom left hand side of your screen. Moving over to the weak mode preset, it goes down to 5.71 milliseconds. Moving down to medium, it goes to 5.45 milliseconds, but then going on to strong, you can see it's actually pretty impressive at 4.04 seconds. Now do bear in mind the RGB overshoot. I just want you to visually remember it, but I will allude to it in just a second. So now we're switching to 270Hz with the overdrive mode set to off. You can see the average initial time is 5.55 milliseconds. As we move over to weak, it goes to 5.29 milliseconds. Then we move over to medium, it sits at 4.01 milliseconds. But then on its strongest mode preset, we're getting to a stonkingly low 2.77 milliseconds. Now remember what I said about the RGB overshoot? Look towards the middle of your screen where you'll see a lot of red at 270Hz, and now we switch back to 240Hz and you can see it's all green. Effectively, at 240Hz, you're getting a better visual experience, all while getting a slightly slower response time. If you are a hardcore competitive gamer, however, you might want to consider incurring a little bit of that visual impairment due to the inverse ghosting at 270Hz due to you getting a significantly better response time. Now to further emphasize the point, you can see here the Blurbuster UFO ghosting test, and indeed here at 240Hz, there is no significant inverse ghosting that occurs from the off to strong modes. Boost mode does incur a little bit of inverse ghosting, but really clears up that UFO, and indeed this is motion blur reduction mode, boost being the strongest mode that you can actually attain. Now at 270Hz you can see that between off and medium there's no inverse ghosting, whereas on strong there's a little bit of trailing that occurs. Yet again on the boost mode it's very much the same, whereby you still have a clearer UFO. Now aside from the objective numbers, what about when it comes to my subjective opinion as someone who's reviewed over 200 monitors and shoved over 2,500 hours on competitive Counter-Strike? I can say that when I was playing a game such as CSGO, the inverse ghosting was pretty minimal, so much so that I was very much content playing on the strongest mode overdrive at 270Hz. But when I was playing a more visually intensive game, such as let's say Destiny 2, I actually found myself gravitating towards 240Hz on its strongest mode overdrive, or going at 270Hz and downscaling the overdrive mode to medium. Effectively, it really depends as to the games you're playing and as to what you should expect. Now, as for the differences between 270Hz and 240Hz, you will not be able to tell the difference, at least as far as refresh rate goes. Of course, bearing in mind what I've just mentioned when it comes to the response time, if you are a Twitch-based gamer or indeed a very hardcore competitive gamer, then you might want to opt for the higher refresh rate purely due to its response time, not indeed its overall refresh rate. Hopefully that all makes sense, but if you've got any questions, do pop them down in the comment section below. Now, the response time of any monitor is of course important, but equally is the input lag, and arguably I would say input lag is almost more important when it comes to any gaming monitor. Now, in this respect, the monitor actually clocked in at a very low 2.4 milliseconds. You can see here how it compares to some of its competitors. Now, it's worth bearing in mind it has got a low input lag mode on and off, and with it off, it jumps up to a whopping 5.5 milliseconds, which is among one of the slowest monitors that I've ever tested. Frankly, there is no real need to disable low input lag mode, given that there is no inherent disadvantages, and similarly, the fact that low input lag mode enabled runs with HDR, NVIDIA G-Sync, AMD FreeSync at 1440p and at 270Hz without any sort of problems. As such, you'll definitely want to have this mode enabled at all times. Now, just to further emphasize the point, here you can see how it compares to other 1440p monitors, including some high refresh rate monitors, in other words over 240Hz, and yet again the AOC monitor does a stupendously good job. Now, moving past hardcore competitive gaming, what about when it comes to casual gaming? Well, this monitor has got AMD FreeSync technology built in and is also G-Sync compatible, not to be confused with a G-Sync module monitor which would give you the full VRR range. And indeed, in this respect, this monitor has got a VRR range of 48Hz up to 270Hz. Of course, if you're running at 240Hz, it'll be 48 to 240, and therefore can't quite compete in terms of providing you a fantastic tear-free gaming experience such as the likes of the Alienware AW2721D. Now, nonetheless, I connected it up to my RTX 3080 via a DisplayPort, and I was able to run the NVIDIA Pendulum demo without any problems. No black screen issues or flickering to report. Now, better still, I was able to play Destiny 2 with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled, HDR, 1440p and at 240Hz/270Hz. Indeed, both refresh rates worked without any sort of problems. This will give you a good tear-free gaming experience, but do bear in mind, while I did mention that it does not have a native G-Sync module, and therefore if you are on Team Green, in other words NVIDIA, you will be actually left potentially a little bit disappointed, as towards the lower frames it can't quite compete in comparison to some of its competitors. Now, similarly, its HDR experience is slightly subdued, specifically in comparison to some of its competitors. Now, even though it's got the display HDR400 certification, it does get to 526 nits, which is far surpassing 400 nits, which is required for HDR400, but just shy of the HDR600 standard. Now, playing Destiny 2, I did feel that the HDR experience could have been a little bit better, whereby the colours did pop, but just seemed a little bit washed out for my liking. Again, further emphasizing the point that some of its competitors, at least when it comes to FreeSync, G-Sync, or indeed HDR, were a little bit superior. On that note, the adaptive sync technologies do not work simultaneously with MBR, motion blur reduction, which is quite a shame. So here is yet again something that some of its competitors do offer, whereby you can use the two technologies in tandem together, giving you a fantastic motion blur reduction and also the tear-free gaming experience that you might crave. Now, on a quick side note for console gamers, and by that I mean those people who have a PC and also a console, because you'd never get a over 144Hz monitor if you're solely gaming on console, this monitor will run 120Hz at 1080p and 1440p. Better still, it accepts a virtual 4K input, therefore allowing you to play 4K HDR at 60Hz. So with the gaming section out of the way, what about when it comes to its image quality? Well, this monitor runs a 27-inch flat 1440p 270Hz monitor. Now, for the sake of these tests, I actually ran it at 240Hz in order not to get any sort of chroma subsampling. So just bear in mind that all these results shared are at 240Hz with the full RGB range. Speaking of which, here through the monitor's OSD you have got a dedicated sRGB emulation mode, and in said mode I had the gamut coverage tested at 90.4% and the gamut volume at 91%. You can see below how it compares to the sRGB standard. As for the overall color accuracy, it's actually stupidly good, at an average delta of 0.88 and a maximum of 2.82 out of the box, which is seriously impressive for image editors or video graders. Its test of contrast ratio is a little bit subpar for an IPS panel at 966:1, but its measured white point is absolutely bang on at 6404 Kelvin at 100% in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target. Indeed, it is that close. Similarly, the same sort of praise could be given about its gamma curve, sitting extremely close to the 2.2 standard. Now, the only limitation is that in sRGB mode you have a locked brightness, and as a result means that if you do want to tinker around the brightness, or indeed want a wider color gamut for those images to pop a little bit more in color, you might want to go for one of the other preset modes that you can select through the OSD. In my case, I used warm, and here you can see that the gamut coverage and gamut volume for sRGB, Adobe RGB and DCI-P3 are all positively impacted. Now below you can see how it compares to the Adobe RGB standard, and yet again in terms of the overall color accuracy, both in terms of average delta E and maximum delta E, these are again in comparison to the Adobe RGB standard and not the sRGB standard. Here the test of contrast ratio doesn't change, and yet again the measured white point is seriously impressive at 6609 Kelvin at 100%, and same could be said about the gamma curve, sitting extremely close to the 2.2 standard. Now moving on, we get onto brightness, which I did allude to before, and here in HDR it sits at 526 nits. In SDR it's still very impressive at 402 nits, and it gets all the way down to 32 nits, showing a good amount of range. Here you can see that sRGB is limited to 150 nits, which in my opinion is a bit too dim. As for the MBR20 or boost mode setting, it does get all the way down to 59 nits, making it actually a little bit unplayable unless you're in a complete pitch black room. Now this does perfectly bring me onto its brightness uniformity, and across the board it's actually really impressive. Of course this is somewhat panel lottery, so your panel might differ from mine. Now as for the overall IPS glow, there is some, at least on my panel I could notice it on the bottom right corner. It didn't throw me off in the slightest, but of course if you want a monitor that does not have any sort of IPS bleed, then you're simply going to have to look at a VA panel. Now to round off this review, I should have a quick word about its design, and here I like what AOC have done. They've kept things simple and also not included a very aggressive black and red finish like they normally do, namely when it comes to its stand. Indeed over here it's a triangular stand which does work pretty well in terms of my IKEA threaded desk, and in this respect is an all black finish. In fact, you will notice a little bit of red at the back of the monitor, or indeed at the front where there's the AGON logo, although here it is actually painted in a slight metallic colour and therefore actually makes it look pretty snazzy. As for the monitor itself, it's got a three-side borderless design with a relatively thin bezel at the bottom. Better still, the stand itself does provide height, tilt, pivot and swivel adjustments, meaning that you can get the right sort of ergonomics. Of course, if you don't want it stand, you can ditch it altogether and replace it via VESA compatible stand. Aside from that, I should mention that there is a small little headphone stand that props up towards the side of the monitor, making it quite handy. And as for the monitor's OSD, it can be accessed through a small little joystick button found behind the monitor, and also gives you a comprehensive list of options which are intuitively laid out and easy to navigate. So with all of that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and here the AOC AGON AG275QZ actually does really impress across the board, specifically where it comes to its sRGB color accuracy and also its gaming performance, whereby input lag, refresh rate and also its response time are all very good across the board and compete with some of the best out there on the market. The problem, however, is its overall asking price and all the features that it offers. See, there's an alternative from Asus that offers ELMB sync, therefore allowing you to run adaptive sync and the MBR mode simultaneously together. You've got the likes of the Alienware monitor, which then offers a native G-Sync module, giving you a better VR range when you're running NVIDIA G-Sync. Or of course, you've got the ones from Samsung, which come in at a slightly cheaper price, but then gives you a far superior HDR experience. Ultimately over here, there's some alternatives you should consider, and at the time of filming and indeed at the price that I'm reviewing it at, I can't wholeheartedly recommend this AOC monitor. but I'll be intrigued to know what you make of it down in the comments section below. And of course, if you've liked this independent detailed review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye.